And John is going to stay on the stage. We're going to begin our panel on little data. So I'm going to introduce the other two panelists. John is going to chair this session. I would like to invite to the stage Associate Professor Colin Gavaghan and also Nick Blakeley. And as they come up and get their lapel microphones on, let me introduce them to you so that you know who they are and where they're from. So first of all, Associate Professor Colin Gavaghan is the first director of the New Zealand Law Foundation's sponsored Centre for Law and Policy in Emerging Technologies. The centre examines the legal and ethical and policy issues around new tech. Colin also lectures and writes on medical and criminal law, and he's leading a 3-year project exploring the legal, ethical and social implications of artificial intelligence for New Zealand. Colin, give them a wave so they know which one you are. Yes, that one. Give them a round of applause. And down the far end is Nick Blakeley. He's the Deputy Chief Executive of Insights and Investment at the Ministry of Social Development, which provides awareness and builds tools to support the best possible decision-making of everyone from ministers to case managers at the front line. Nick started at the Ministry in 2013, initially as Deputy Chief Executive for Social Policy, and before that he worked for Treasury and was Economic Advisor to the Minister of Finance. Nick also has a PhD in electrical engineering, which will be handy if anything goes wrong with the tech stuff today. So with John and the chair, they're going to talk about how algorithms affect our daily lives. And again, can I remind you, when it comes to question time, just wait for the mic so that everybody watching this via live stream can also hear the questions. So let's begin it with a round of applause for all three of them to make them feel good.
So, good morning. So my name's Colin Gavaghan. I'm here from Otago University. I'm not really a privacy expert. I feel slightly fraudulent in this capacity. I am, as Michele said, the director of the New Zealand Law Foundation Centre for Law and Policy in Emerging Technologies. It's a pretty long name. Luckily, we're blessed with a nice catchy, this one here, a nice catchy acronym for that. I've been cracking that joke since I arrived here about 8 years ago in the vain hope that one day somebody can actually find a way to turn that into something that scans really nicely. But I shouldn't be too nasty about it. That's sponsored by the New Zealand Law Foundation, who've also very generously sponsored the project I'm currently running, which is looking at the implications, legal and social and economic, of what we're referring to as artificial intelligence, because it's a term that resonates with the public, even though it's become apparent to us that quite a lot of what we're talking about barely, if at all, merits that designation. So with that in mind, we've recently set up a second centre, which is a multidisciplinary hub, really, involving people from computer sciences, from philosophy, from economics, and of course from law, that will be considering the implications of this technology. And I should say, I very much welcome the overtures that have been made to us by the government and by the Privacy Commissioner's Office to collaborate with them in that regard. It's brilliant to see this being taken so seriously. Now, I'm fairly sure there's a cognitive bias in play, at least for me. Whenever I start looking at a new subject, I start seeing it everywhere. I start seeing it in the papers, I start seeing it in the media. I switch on Netflix of a night to try and chill out, and there it is again. But even with that in mind, I think objectively there really is an awful lot of attention being given to what we might call AI. Some of it, much of it, I guess, is at the level of very high level kind of existential risks. You see things rather frequently like this. Elon Musk regularly warning us that essentially we're doomed, and that our best hope probably is to invest in colonising Mars and just leaving this rock behind. Now, it does occur to me, if Elon Musk is right and that it's the die's already cast and that AI is going to be ruling the world fairly soon, then prudentially, what we ought to do about that isn't entirely clear. And if anybody's familiar with the philosophical thought experiment called Rocco's Basilisk, which kind of suggests the smartest move right now would be to indicate that we're very much on board with that. And I'd just like to say with that in mind that I thoroughly welcome our putative future robot overlords. But we and always have. But we're not really concerned about that level in the project. We're concerned about much more mundane applications. Now, a fair bit of what I'm going to say here, in fact, John has already alluded to. But we've seen these stories appearing in the media over the last year or two, increasingly about government departments and other public, kind of adjacent public bodies using algorithms. And we've been contacted a lot by the media to comment on them. At the moment, the situation is there's no particular clarity about who precisely is using what. But one thing I feel I should say before we go any further, and it's this: we are, how would I put it, optimistically demanding or sceptical about the use of algorithms. We are certainly not cynical, and we're certainly not ill-disposed towards their use. We can anticipate a whole range of positives flowing from the use of this technology. And in part, I guess that's because as a lawyer myself, I harbour no illusions about putatively perfect human decision makers. I'm entirely aware of the fact that humans make decisions, that humans, myself included, are subject to cognitive biases and logical fallacies and all the rest of it. So it's maybe worth identifying, first of all, some of the positive, the possible, and I think very real upsides to the use of this technology. It is possible that it can be a lot more accurate than humans. It's possible that it can be a lot more efficient, particularly when it comes to processing vast amounts of information. We are not particularly good as a species at doing that. It's possible that this technology could be. And I mentioned the other possibility of removing or improving on human bias. Now, none of these things can be assumed. All of them potentially should be demanded of systems like this before, particularly before we spend a very great deal of money on them potentially. There are, of course, downsides. John's alluded to some of them already. There are concerns about the erosion of discretion on the part of the decision maker if decisions are devolved to an algorithm, about transparency, of course, and about the possibility that these may replicate or reinforce bias. Now, I say again that in many contexts we are not deluding ourselves that human decision makers are free from bias. What may be of particular concern in this context is that, I'll come back to this in a second, but perhaps not so much that they will make the bias worse, but they will replicate the bias while creating the impression that it's been dispensed with, that moving this onto a kind of algorithmic or computerized basis means it's not something we need to worry about anymore. I want to talk about erosion of discretion first of all. I think Cathy O'Neill's going to get a lot of plugs this morning somehow. But in this book, this is how she puts it. She says this: you cannot appeal to a weapon of math destruction, is the pun she uses throughout. That's part of their fearsome power. They do not listen, nor do they bend. They're deaf not only to charm, threats, and cajoling, but also to logic, even where there's good reason to question the data that feeds their conclusions. Now, is this a bad thing? I guess whether this is a good or a bad thing depends on a number of considerations. Discretion, after all, is also the mechanism that allows for nepotism and cronyism and for human bias to be given effect. So it's not apparent to me that in all cases, dispensing with this decisional discretion will be an unmitigated bad thing. But it certainly is a thing. It certainly is a factor to consider where there are perhaps examples, and we now have people like Michele A'Court and Danielle Keats-Citron, I beg your pardon, in the States, who's arguing that there are certain kinds of decisions that by their very nature necessitate a degree of discretion, and that we should be very wary of ever handing those on to algorithms. That's maybe something we could discuss later. John's already talked about transparency. Two reasons why transparency is becoming an obstacle. One of them, as he says, relates to the question of their proprietary nature. The companies who make them and sell them simply don't want to disclose precisely how the decision within what's increasingly referred to as the black box is being arrived at. And the second is a suggestion that, well, machine learning maybe just doesn't work that way. Well, John referred to the case of Loomis, where the court recognised that part of the problem, part of Mr. Loomis's concern, he was bringing a due process complaint against a decision made by this Compass algorithm. Part of the problem was that North Point weren't prepared to disclose the workings. They weren't prepared to disclose the weightings and the manner in which the algorithm kind of worked. There are concerns really about this, about how we just, as the XKCD cartoon says, just keep stirring the pile of data until the results start looking like you would want. The second problem really is about the nature of machine learning. Now, I'll say a little bit more about this later if time permits, but some of what we're referring to as algorithms at the moment are pretty simple from this point of view. So, for example, the Rockroy algorithm used by the Department of Corrections to make predictions about future offending has been around since the 1990s, and the input variables and the weightings given to them are pretty transparent to anybody who wants to see them. The concern, I think, is more as we move down the road towards machine learning and get to a stage where potentially there's literally no one can tell you exactly how the decision is being made anymore. And finally, I should say a little bit about the question of bias. A book I'd thoroughly recommend in this regard is Frank Pascal's Black Box Society, and he put it like this. He said, human biases and values are embedded into each and every step of development. Computerization may simply drive discrimination upstream, and I think that's the concern for a lot of people. We're not kidding ourselves that, for example, the justice system doesn't contain implicit and institutional biases. We only have to look at our imprisonment figures for Maori people, over 50% of the prison population, but only 15% of the actual population. Something's going wrong with that picture. The concern, I think, is this driving it upstream, this concern that it's, well, how can a computer be racist, right? There's nothing even to see here, nothing to question. The ProPublica report that John talked about, and we really should liaise in future to make sure we don't wear the same outfit a bit more, I think, raised an interesting concern about not so much the error rate. This is what was interesting about the ProPublica report on the Compass algorithm. What it found was, when it was trying to predict future offending, it made about the same number of errors for black and for white defendants. The error rate was broadly the same between them both. But the direction of error was diametrically opposite. So what they found was that black defendants were much more likely to be assessed as being riskier than they actually were, whereas white defendants, the error was in the opposite direction. Their risk was being under-evaluated, underrated. So it's not just, you know, if the company were simply to give you a figure, so this is our accuracy rate and our error rate, that's good to know, but it's only part of what's good to know. What kind of mistakes are being made and how they impact different populations, I think is going to be equally important. So what can we do about all this? A range of regulatory and government measures have been mooted. We've been, in our projects so far, we've been to Europe, to the UK, to Paris to meet the OECD. We've spoken to experts from the USA. And a number of models have now been put forward or are being suggested or, in fact, are being implemented. And we're now at the stage of the, I think, discussion of this topic where the pushback started, where we're actually seeing some critical responses to some of these initiatives, suggesting that maybe they're not actually going to be as useful as all that. Some of them rely on individual rights. Some of them rely on agencies and regulators. And I know there's a lot of discussion taking place now, both in the UK and in New Zealand, about the possibility of some kind of agency with, at very least, oversight of this area, and with the capacity perhaps to offer best practice guidance. Whether it has more regulatory clout than that is a subject for ongoing discussion. Self-regulatory models. So we've heard already about the FRAE ethics and ethical evaluation tool that Tim Dare and others are developing or have developed at the MSD. In the UK, we met with a police force in Durham who are trialling an algorithm to basically assess the suitability of arrestees for what we would call here diversion rather than prosecution. And they've implemented what they call the AlgoCare acronym, another group that are better at acronyms than what I am, to make an awful lot of, answer a lot of questions before they decide whether this should even be used. And finally, we have design-based models. So explainable AI, for example, is a growth area. How can we construct algorithms in such a way that they can offer an explanation for their decision that is not only accurate, but is actually intelligible to non-experts? I want to focus just for the last wee bit of the talk on individual rights models. These can take a number of forms. They can relate to general rights that we already have. A big part of what I do in the centre, the students I teach, is to say, before we start scratch building new regulatory mechanisms and rights for the digital era. Let's look and see what we have already, and let's see whether it's fit for purpose or whether it can be made fit for purpose. So a lot of this will have to do with rights we already have around privacy, around freedom from discrimination on certain kinds of protected grounds. Two particular rights have been discussed, mentioned already by John, and they come from something I just have a feeling you're going to hear a bit more about during today, and that's this famous GDPR, which will be coming into effect later this month. And one of them is the right to information about the existence of automated decision-making and meaningful information about the logic involved in that decision, the so-called right to an explanation, as it's being discussed in the literature. And secondly, Article 22, the right not to be subject to a decision based solely on automated processing. We're interested in looking at both of these. But as I say, already the criticisms have started coming back from people like Lillian Edwards and Michael Veal in the UK, who are saying, well, this is great as far as it goes, but it only goes so far. One concern is practical. Is a comprehensive explanation always possible? In our evidence to the UK's Select Committee, Janet Basterman, who we got to work with a bit in the UK, tried to explain that the nature of some of the more advanced systems, particularly in machine learning, make it extremely difficult to render explanations intelligible, and thought needs to be given about how to operationalise any right of this nature. This is where maybe something like explainable AI may become interesting. Now, I came across this case a couple of days ago when I was doing a bit of digging into this report. It's a Privacy Commissioner's case from 2010 that talked about in ensuring accuracy of information held about you, the requirement for a manual notation for a human being effectively to be kept in the loop in terms of that decision. It was about a woman who'd incurred a debt that was transferred to a debt collector because she defaulted in her payment at a particular time, and she claimed an error had been made in processing the information held about her. Now, this is one there's a lot of talk about in Europe just now because of the GDPR, and we're also seeing it coming up actually in other contexts. Driverless cars, for example, as long as there's a human behind the wheel, ready to take control if things go wrong, ready to check the decision that the machine's making, maybe that's something that we should be reassured about. Well, we're not so sure in some cases. One of the concerns that's arising here is about the possibility of false reassurance. How good are we going to be at second-guessing the machine? We're hearing about things like automation bias, for example, in that regard, that our capacity to overrule the machine is going to be a bit less impressive than we might think it is. If your boss says we've just invested X million dollars in this state-of-the-art prediction algorithm, but do feel free to tell us if you think it's got it wrong, how good are we going to be at doing that? And if and when we do that, we're being told, and we've worked with some psychologists in this, it may be that we will be subject to what's called judgmental atrophy, that the fact that we are only rarely being called upon to exercise these decisional capacities means that they kind of start to diminish, to atrophy, if you like. A nice article, for those who are interested here, by Marion Oswald and her team in the UK. It's talked about this idea of automation bias, the idea that our capacity will diminish or erode. And I'm going to leave you with a pretty evocative picture that you may have seen in the last month. The first passenger to be killed by a driverless car in the USA. Everybody see this one? I should say, by the way, from a privacy point of view, the first thing that struck me about this was, what on earth were the police playing at, releasing that footage within a few days of the incident? I thought that was astonishing. But the second thing that was interesting was a huge amount of criticism and opprobrium has been directed at the control driver, who appeared, as best we can tell from the footage, not to be paying attention to the road at the time when the passenger was struck. Now, I have a little bit more sympathy for that person than a lot of people do, because the psychologists we've been talking to have been suggesting that's a very hard thing to do. To remain in this position of inert but alert for prolonged periods, ready to dive in and exercise control is difficult, but also we've been hearing recently from experts in human systems and psychology that the reaction time for someone acting as a supervisor is far slower than the reaction time for someone acting as an agent. It's just a fact. It's just something that happens to us. So I guess the thought I want to leave you with this here is we're not saying these ideas that of a right to an explanation and that a right to a human in the loop are bad ideas. We just need to give a little bit of thought to how they could become genuinely effective and reassuring, and not just a kind of paying lip service kind of exercise. So I'm going to leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Colin. I'm going to use inert but alert as my explanation for my next sort of nodding off at a meeting. Nick, why don't you now take the stage? You've been introduced. I won't take up more time by extolling your virtues and your hobbies, but there's something gone a little bit funny with this. I wonder if you mind having a look at it for me. But tell us what the Ministry of Social Development is doing in this area. I mean, it seems to me that you're in a position where you have been subjected to an almost constant demand for the last few years, since I've been Privacy Commissioner, to extract the value from public data sets. Not unreasonably. These are public assets. They should be used for the public good. So how does the ministry approach that imperative, which is becoming increasingly urgent from ministers, taking into account the kinds of things that Colin and I have discussed this morning?
Yeah, great. Kia ora, everyone. Maybe to start, excuse me, I've got a bit of a cold. I should acknowledge John put up the finding his investigation last year, and so look, we take that on the chin. We got that wrong, and we've learnt from that, and we do take the privacy and human rights and ethics of what we're doing very seriously, and I hope you'll see that through some of what I talk about here. But I do want to start with the fact that what would happen otherwise, and Colin touched a bit on this already, that decision-making is something that has existed for as long as there's been a welfare system or any organisation, that we've needed to determine who's eligible for something or what support is going to be best to help this person in these circumstances. And traditionally those decisions have been made by humans. And if anyone's read Thinking Fast and Slow by Daniel Kahneman, you'll know that there's a number of these cognitive biases that mean that human decision-making is far from perfect. So the counterfactual, or what would otherwise happen, you need to be considering that when you're looking at what a predictive model or analytics can do. So these tools to help that decision-making is what's becoming more sophisticated over time. And it is worth dwelling on the opportunity that this creates. A couple of years ago, there's a board game called Go, which is a really complicated game. It's got a number of different possible moves from any one stage of the board. And a computer program was developed using some of these deep learning methods to beat the best in the world. And he actually won one game. It was 4-1. Since then, they've continued to develop the algorithm, and now their latest version of the same software can beat the version that beat the best in the world every time. So it's now at the level of superhuman effort, and they're looking at how they put that into other applications. So what problems would you like to put superhuman analysis to? That is a huge opportunity. And if you think about some of the things in government or health sector, if you had a mammogram and you're looking for cancer tumours, it's at the stage now where an algorithm will be better than a doctor. In fact, you probably wouldn't want a doctor being the one who's making the judgment eventually. So it's at that kind of level. And so what could we apply that to? In our business, we've got to make decisions about how do we help people to get the most support? Who's most likely in need? And what support's going to work best for them? Those are decisions that we should be able to use some of this technology to help us with. So it is, the superhuman analysis is a bit like a superpower, and as was it Uncle Ben said to Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. And so it's incumbent on us to work out how do we do this responsibly and safely. There's a number of, and this is an emerging area, and so there's a number of techniques that we don't have the full answer yet, but we can see where some of the things are pointing us to. Transparency is definitely first, and I acknowledge that we aren't transparent enough currently about what we're doing with people's data in terms of these methods, not because we've been hiding it, but simply because it hasn't been a focus, and we're trying to rectify that now. We've got some work underway to try and get some good explanations of what we're doing. And that's not just about putting an algorithm on the website, because not many people will actually be able to understand what that's saying. The points that Colin made are really good ones. You have to explain how it's used, what's the business setting that it's used in. So it's not just the model itself, it's how is it then applied, where are humans in the loop or not, how is it applied, and the algorithm itself, how can you explain what it's doing? This field of explainable AI, I think, has got something, some real promise to be able to explain why the model is giving the predictions it is. So what we've been developing over the last couple of years has been alluded to as this thing called a privacy, human rights and ethics framework, which is really a structured way of us asking all of those types of questions on the way through when we're designing a new service. And we've been iterating that framework, and it certainly isn't finalised yet. We need to keep on iterating as some more of these ideas and tools become available. But I think it is, so that my short answer would be it's taking it seriously. And having the tools and processes in place to make sure that we are systematically taking into account these things as we are designing a service. It's not just an add-on at the end, it's right from the get-go we're thinking about these things.
I wanted to ask you, Colin, because you have this rare combination of skill sets of law and ethics. Now, when I travel around the world...
Almost an oxymoron, really, isn't it? One might say, but...
When I travel around the world, when I go to regulation-resistant places like the US, they talk about maybe we need an ethical framework here. When I go to Europe, that recognises a fundamental human right in this stuff, they say let's legislate. Where does the role for law stop and ethics start? What does ethics do in this space? Is it a proxy? Is it something that we don't have enough courage to regulate, so we'll have ethics, or we don't have enough information to regulate, so we have ethics? Or is ethics a better response because it's more flexible?
That's a small and easy question to start with. I think the one thing we would be so before I became a kind of a tech lawyer, I was a medical lawyer, and I was interested in medical ethics. And one thing that's become a great concern in the USA is that medical ethicists and bioethicists have a role as kind of rubber stamping the practice of the pharmaceutical industry. So that's the most concerning part, is that ethics becomes this kind of nominal step instead of the kind of regulation that's actually required. So it ought not to be that. I guess I would say that it's something that should, in an ideal world, inform the law, that it should sit alongside it. It may be more flexible, so there's a model that we could perhaps look at. I also sit in a body called A'Court, which is the regulatory body for reproductive technologies in New Zealand, and it's seen as being kind of more flexible in some ways than the legislature in responding to a fast-moving area of technology. So you don't want necessarily to be taking the primary legislation back to Parliament all the time, every time something new happens. So these kind of arm's-length bodies, in a way, that are populated by a combination of experts and lay people, have an advantage in that regard. The downside, I suppose, is that we perhaps don't have the kind of democratic legitimacy that Parliament may have. But they are, across certainly the UK and here, they're seen as being a more agile response, I suppose, a more agile and a more flexible response to fast-moving technologies.
So in your ideal world, we would have a legal framework supported by an ethical an ethical advisory kind of function?
At least that. Yeah, we're certainly recommending that there should be at least some kind of body somewhere. Now, we're completely neutral as to who should take that role on, but who has an overview of what's actually happening in this regard. We shouldn't be having situations where Minister Tolley in the last government and Minister Elise Galloway now are surprised when stories about algorithms breach in the media and immediately slam the brakes on and bring them to a halt. Nobody thinks that's ideal. So some kind of perhaps pre-procurement, pre-rollout evaluation. I don't know if anybody, I should maybe say something about this. There's a lot of hype around AI at the moment. There's an awful lot of people offering to sell very high-tech solutions. You guys have probably come across this as well. Some of them are probably brilliant, some of them less so. I don't know if anybody heard about the story in Spin-Off a few months ago. David Farrier broke about Zach, the medical algorithm in Christchurch, which may or may not even exist. So, you know, a pre-procurement, pre-rollout evaluation seems like the bare minimum, but also perhaps that has the capacity to offer, as I said, best practice guidelines across the sector. Now, the UK government has been resistant to anything with more regulatory kind of teeth than that. They're clear this is an oversight and governance body, but not a regulator. We're neutral at the moment as to, as I say, the talks are beginning with different parts of government as to whether we need something more substantive, regulatorily substantive than that. But at very least, yes, something of that nature I think is required quite urgently too.
So is what you've done, Nick, at the Ministry with the Privacy, Human Rights and Ethics Framework, an attempt to fill this gap, would that work be supported by a legislative framework? That's my first question. My second is, we're talking at a fairly high level. I wonder if you can make it real for us and tell us some of the applications that you're seeing come through that framework or that you're testing. Here's your platform to pitch the value proposition.
Yeah.
Where are we seeing that benefit?
Yeah. So to answer the first bit, that I guess, yes, it is filling what we saw as a gap. And what we've been trying to do is work with other government agencies who see value in this approach as well. We've been testing it with a number of other government agencies over the past few months, and it has the potential to be developed into something that could be used more widely across government. We've been meeting with the relevant kind of chief executive groups across government who have endorsed the continued development of this. So whether there's a separate agency or a separate group, I think those are good discussions to be having. They're exactly the right things we should be talking about. In terms of making it real, maybe to use one example where we currently have a predictive model in operation. So we only have a couple of predictive models that are actually being used operationally. And one of those is in our youth service. So this is a service for 16 and 17-year-olds. And at the time that this was established, the concern was there was a large number of 16 and 17-year-olds who were dropping out of school and weren't going into education, employment or training, and were then, in a few years' time, ending up with a benefit, and their life chances weren't looking that positive. So the question was, well, could we try and help those kids before they get into that situation? And maybe as soon as they've left school, as soon as they've dropped out of school, could we be getting the information from the Ministry of Education so that then we could be identifying who are those potential kids and reaching out to them to have support through NGO providers, youth service providers. And so then the question is, well, how do you do that reaching out? And do you go to all of the kids who have suddenly left school, or do you go to just a subset who you think are probably most at risk? And so it was decided at the time that we would go to just those most at risk, and then we needed to have some way of doing that. Was that going to be some crude rules, business rules, which would be probably the alternative, or develop a predictive model based on, and that could be trained from the history and the data to be able to then predict who's most at risk of being on benefits in a few years' time. And so we went down that road, and that's now in operation. But there's a few, as part of the process then, we didn't have the current framework then, but there are already tools available like privacy impact assessments and so on that we were using at the time. And through that there are a number of safeguards in place. So one of those is where there is human decision making in the loop. So for example, when if we've said that a particular kid is high risk and we've given that name to the provider, they then contact them. Then there's no obligation on that young person to say yes to be part of the service. So that's one step. And if they do, then the provider might say, actually, this person doesn't look like they're medium risk. They're actually more of a high risk, and and they can talk to us about that, and so they can sort of override what the model initially showed. So I think that you need to have a look at the model, not just in isolation, but that's part of that whole business process for how it works, and what are the, to use your example of the letter A, what are the downsides to getting it wrong? I think that's a really big part of it, and to keep that in mind, if this does get it wrong, what are the safeguards that might be able to correct things over time?
Thanks. I think these stories about valuable and useful and legitimate uses of this technology are a really important part of this conversation. And I had a police officer come to see me a few months ago, and she was trialling a system in her district as part of the police response to domestic violence call-outs. And they were using a predictive risk model. They had the technology to go into the woman's home and interview her and record there. But they would get the ID of the offender. It would ping back off their iPad back into NIA and report back how they scored on a predictive model of future violence based on a pretty robust data set. And that was to assess the safety for that woman on that day and the nature of the intervention. Should this person be taken out of that property right then and there? What is the risk? And I think if you can add some science in there and reduce the human error to improve the safety of that individual, checked against the validity sometimes of hunches and human instinct, you do establish the value proposition. Colin, I wanted to ask you something. We're talking about, we're actually, the kinds of things that Nick describes, I think you would expect a government to be doing. That almost tentative steps at the efficient allocation of scarce government resources. You mentioned artificial intelligence, and I fear that as we start some of these conversations, we actually don't do so from a common understanding of what some of these terms mean. We expect that we do. But if we have true artificial intelligence, if we have real machine learning, we get to a point that I've heard described as designed unpredictability, that you can get an output, I think you alluded to it, and you can ask the person who designed the system, how did the machine come up with this? Yeah. And they will not be able to answer because it has travelled such a long way from that initial code.
Absolutely right.
How do we even prepare for that scenario?
Yeah, it's a cracker, isn't it? I mean, one of the first things I learned in this project when I started working with, so one of my close collaborators on this is a guy called Ali Knott, who works for a company called Soul Machines in Auckland, and they actually build these systems. And we got a bunch of computer scientists in a room, and one of the first things I asked was, what exactly is artificial intelligence? And there were as many definitions as there were computer science. In fact, there were more because some of them changed their mind as the discussion went on. I think the House of Lords report in the UK last month said they got something like 28 different definitions from the submissions made to them. So I'm not even going to try. Much as lawyers like precise definitions, I'm not even going to try. But John, I think you're right in what you say is that the concern about the domain into which you're moving of machine learning is exactly that. So the feature about these things that's both so impressive and makes them such an elusive regulatory target in a sense is that they learn, you know, and the version of the machine that you bought from the designer in the first place will not be identical to the thing that you're using a year down the line because it's refined its techniques by testing them, I guess, as it moves on. But that's great in a sense because it improves their predictive power and it improves their accuracy. But it raises a number of questions. One of them is about accountability when things go wrong. At what point does the designer of that algorithm get to hold their hands up and say, well, it's unrecognizable from the thing I sold you now. It's taught itself a whole bunch of stuff, not my fault. But it also creates problems for things like transparency. How can anybody, it's not just this question of commercial sensitivity, because you can deal with that by legal means. You know, you can have a rule that says, well, the government will not buy any system that's locked down in terms of its IP in that way. We won't buy the system from you unless you're willing to give an account. That's, I don't know about politically, but legally that's not a hard thing to do. But what do you do when literally nobody can tell you what working went on inside that black box? And I guess the solution there, if we thought it was important enough, would be to say, again, we're just not going to buy a system that's that opaque. You know, we're going to require that some kind of explainable AI system be layered on top. at least if we thought it was important enough, that's what we'd have to do.
You touch on a really important point there for me, which is the purchasing power of government. You know, it's the biggest game in town. You know, we can drive these things from a regulatory perspective, we can set up ethical frameworks, but let's not also forget the ability that we have in procurement. I think we should open the discussion to the wider audience, and our guests, experts, let's make the most of them. Jasmine and Savannah will be coming with microphones. We have somebody with a stripe. Is that Nicole in the middle? Jasmine, can you come along to about row E, please? And pass up to the middle. If you could just indicate so I can line you up mentally. Nicole.
Thanks. This question really follows on from the discussion that you were just having, John and Colin. I'm just wondering, where does public law sit in all of this? Because when I hear that Loomis decision about the way in which that decision was made on bail, or if you think about an immigration decision, it has to be rational. We have legal requirements that decision's rational. And at the moment, what we're hearing is that, well, certainly in that case, the decision makers weren't able to show that it was rational. And therefore, aren't you an absolute sitter for a judicial review saying this is Wednesbury unreasonable or whatever else because you can't show that the decision was reasonable? So I'm just wondering, I mean, that's how it plays out in public law. And then we obviously have all sorts of legal issues in the driverless cars one as well. But it seems very clear there that if you're using a system like that, you're vulnerable to judicial review.
Thanks, Colin.
Funnily enough, Colin MacDonald at DIA made a statement about the potential for judicially reviewing algorithmic decisions a few months ago at the Ministerial Summit up here in Wellington. I'm not a public lawyer. Nicole, I defer to Andrew Geddes in that and many, many other things. But I guess if I were trying to defend that from a rational point of view, I would say, well, we know that the kind of input variables that we're feeding in are appropriate ones. And we know that the results, because we're measuring them, the results are as accurate or more accurate than human decision makers. No, we can't tell you precisely what went on inside the black box in terms of decisions, but it's rational to use that system. It's rational to trust that system because it's at least as accurate as we had before. Now, I don't know if that would pass muster. I don't know if you would need to. You don't think so, no?
Well,
No.
a couple of points that I would make. First is that I think you've put your finger on a problem that really plagues public administration and the efficient administration thereof. Statutory discretions are a really important part of the kind of entitlements regime that Nick's organisation administers. And they require balancing of a number of factors and exercising of a discretion. And I don't think the judiciary would allow that to be supplanted by machine decision making. For my part, I administer the Privacy Act. It has accuracy and fairness requirements in it in Principle 8, as you know. But also I must administer that in a way that is consistent with the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act. And the Bill of Rights Act requires adherence to the principles of natural justice. And I think what you've heard Colin say is that those principles of natural justice require transparency, require an opportunity to comment, require a degree, I think, of introduced scepticism into the level of confidence you might have. I don't know whether you would agree with that, Nicole. But you
No, sure. One thing I should say maybe is with regard to things like sentencing, predictions of future offending are only one factor. The Sentencing Act lists a whole bunch of things that would have to be weighed up there, of which that's only one. I guess one thing that would concern me a little bit is as we move more into the realms of preventive and predictive justice. So we now have a raft of legislation that allows people to be detained, at least nominally civilly, on the basis of what we think they might do in future. And those decisions are very, very heavily influenced by risk evaluations, with not a whole lot else actually on the table at all. These concern me quite a lot because, to put it mildly, these are not very sympathetic characters that are being locked up in that kind of way. And the public concern with safety tends to outweigh an awful lot of these considerations a lot. But that could be one area where I would be really quite concerned.
Can I do a couple of quick responses?
Yeah,
just, so I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to try and get into the legal side of things, but just a couple of observations. One is, again, it goes back to how is it used and what's the context and what else is around it. So sentencing, which can be quite punitive, might be different than using a model to, if we were to proactively text clients that we thought looked like they weren't getting all they were entitled to. We might get it wrong, but if we get it wrong, that's not really the end of the world. And so, again, the context that's used, I think, is a really important aspect. The other angle on the transparency is at the end of Cathy O'Neill's book, which really is, she's very attuned to the risks. That's the point of the book. But she does have a bit of a what's the way forward, and she talks about transparency. She also talks about audits and these and looking at the fairness implications. And so I think this comes to that, how do you delve into not just how the algorithm works, but what's it doing in terms of affecting different client groups or different groups of people differently, and what are the audit approaches for other people to look at them. I think those are all areas that we should be looking at.
That was one of the most striking things that I took away from the book as well, is the need for those feedback mechanisms to check our assumptions. Now, we had a question from the middle, and you have another microphone. Thank you.
Yes, hi, my name's Ros Rice. I'm from Community Networks Aotearoa, and we are a national organisation representing community and voluntary organisations working at the coalface. And I want to direct this particularly at you, Nick, because algorithms are based, my understanding, on concepts that are given a mathematical value. But people are messy, and in our experience, they're not that predictable. Most vulnerable people, because you talk about feedback loops and things like that, don't even know what questions need to be asked or don't have the strength to ask those questions. And I find, and we have found, others and my colleagues have found, that the huge issue is the stigmatising of people into their future lives by decisions made by predictive modelling. And I want to know, how do you rationalise your enthusiasm for algorithms against the very nature of the people who are affected?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, just an explanation of, this is my simple explanation for how some of these algorithms work, because they can be quite quite opaque. But here's a really simple explanation. One way, if you're trying to program a computer to solve noughts and crosses, one way of doing that would be to say, well, if someone goes in the corner, then you should probably go in the middle. And then if they've gone in the middle, or maybe actually if you can get all three in a row, then you should do that first. If you can't get three in a row, then maybe if they can, you should put one there. So you have a set of rules, and you try and put that set of rules into a computer program. That's not the way these modern algorithms work. The way the modern algorithms work is to say, well, if I put an X here, how often will I win? If I put a circle here, how often will I win? So it's probabilistic, it's chances based. And the amazing thing is that with a huge amount of data that you train these things on, they can be incredibly accurate. So which goes to that they're only as accurate as the data that you train them on, which is a whole other set of issues. So they are probabilistic. They don't get it right. You're absolutely right. They're just making based on someone's circumstances, what's the likelihood? And they won't get that right all the time, absolutely. Which I think then goes to how do you use them. So let me give you another example. And I think it also is different whether they're for good or for harm. I think it does. So to give you a good example, or at least what we think is good, we've got case managers who have to make a decision on what's going to help this client the most. They've got the client in front of them, so they're creating that personal relationship that they need to really understand the client. They've also got a whole bunch of background information. So could they also have something on their screen that says, for someone in these circumstances, these are the programs that are likely to work best for them. And then the case manager can say, okay, I've seen that, maybe I'll use that, but maybe I've got a bit more information here, and maybe I don't think that'll be suited for this person in these circumstances. So it's, in my mind, it's how can we use these to augment human decision making, and so that overall we make better decisions.
Can I just quickly respond to that
Yes,
as well?
please.
It prompted a thought about the individual rights-based models that so much weight seem to be put on the GDPR. Now, I'm not saying it's not important. I'm not saying there's no value in us having perhaps a right to an explanation, a right to demand a human overview. But I think there's increasing concern in Europe about the devolving of responsibility to the individual, and sometimes those individuals are going to be among the weakest, most vulnerable least well placed in society to actually hold this system to account. They're also not going to be in a position to really evaluate how these algorithms are using. They might be able to demand some kind of remedy if they personally have been harmed or they personally have suffered some deficit, but they're not going to be ideally placed to evaluate how the system's applying across the wider population if they're having a disproportionate effect on one part of the population, for example. Unless they can cash that out in terms of harm to themselves, they're not really necessarily going to be able to do very much about it. So I think the individual rights model is perhaps part of what we need, but it can't be the whole picture. There needs to be some top-down, wide-angled evaluation of how they're playing out too.
Excellent, thank you. We still have time for some more questions. We have up in the back row, is that Jane? Yes. It is, great, thanks.
It's Jane Foster from the Office of the Privacy Commissioner. But it really follows on from that last question, and I was going to ask it earlier. I'm interested to know if there's been any research in relation to how people whose decisions are made by machines, how it actually affects them in, say, a trust in a system, or how they might behave or interact with that system.
Yeah. Interestingly, we're talking to a psychologist who works with airlines who are training pilots to deal with autopilot systems, for example. You know, how do you keep people in that inert but alert state, if you like, where for very large parts of the journey you're not called upon to do anything at all? How do you do that? And the answer is with great difficulty. Even highly trained pilots, they find it very, very, very difficult. But we've also spoken to the police, we've spoken to other agencies who are concerned about a number of effects. One is this decisional atrophy I was talking about, or this erosion of capacities to make decisions. The police are also talking about a very significant demoralisation effect, where they are finding that they think their role is being deprofessionalised in a sense, that the algorithm, so for example, things like the predpol tool, which is used to deploy officers to particular, what they anticipate are going to be scenes of high criminality. And the police we spoke to in the UK were saying, when we've trialled this stuff, the police find that their discretion, their local knowledge, their professionalism essentially is being eroded, that they're now just kind of little players in a computer game almost, that the controller's sending around and ordering what to do. But we're only just starting to kind of look into that, but there is concern from a number of professions about that very question.
It's interesting, you know, various models have been rolled out to identify deprived communities and things, and I've been at presentations where these have been presented, and you see, you know, the screen narrowed down to a mesh block, and we're told, now this is where this combination of determinants exists. Got some person, some social worker in the front row, shrugging their shoulders and saying, forget about that, I'll take you to their houses.
Yeah, absolutely.
Nick, just following on from Jane's question.
My question was also directed.
It's
also directed at the individual who the decision's been made about. Has there been?
And I want to just put that one to Nick, because you know, when an important part of policy and designing systems and implementing programs is to design in at the front end your evaluation methodology, right? And monitoring. But of course, the principal output that you're trying to evaluate is whether you were effective in achieving the policy objective, diverting those youths to a program that is going to help them or something. Are you also designing in sort of secondary evaluations to check the kinds of questions that Jane is asking, how, you know, what people's experience of the system is, as a kind of meta-evaluation, if you like?
Yeah, well, probably not as much as we should be, actually. I think that, and I guess probably back to one of my earlier comments, I don't think we have enough information for clients currently to know exactly what is happening behind the scenes. I mean, a lot of them are in difficult situations where they may not know what questions to ask. So, you know, what's the information that we can be providing to be able to support that? And I think, again, it goes to how do you, and this is probably a principle-based thing, how do you empower the person who's involved in the service to be part of that decision-making process? That can be a way of, and that's a general point of that, you know, the new government, our minister is very keen on looking at how we can shift the service culture within the ministry, how we can shift from being something that is probably too paternalistic and how we approach things to how do we engage the client more. So in that example I gave before, and I should say we don't have this in place today, but it is the sort of thing I think could be possible, this idea of having information about what service might be best for this client. You don't need to stop at the case manager. That's information that could be a conversation between the case manager and the client, saying, well, here's the sorts of things here, and what do you think is going to work best in your situation? So again, I think it's not just the models, it's how you apply these, and you do need to look at the whole system to evaluate how that's going to work. But I think it's a good point.
Well, look, my clock is telling me it's 10:40.
Yes.
Are you kicking us out?
I pretty much am.
I want to thank Nick and Colin for that enormously valuable contribution about both the theoretical and practical parameters in which this work has taken place. I hope you'll take the opportunity to tackle them during the break, and we'll see you back in a few minutes. Thank you so much.